Hello, my name is Josh Dye and I'm on staff with Housing Link. Housing Link is a nonprofit organization and our service is our website, www.housinglink.org. Landlords and property managers use our website to post their rental housing openings for free. Renters will use our website to search for housing that fits their budgets, and social service organizations and government agencies use our website to find housing resources that will help their clients, as well as help them make sound housing decisions for their communities. The presentation today and the topic we'll be talking about is fair housing. A quick disclaimer before I get started is that I'm not an attorney and that this presentation is not legal advice. It's simply an overview of fair housing in Minnesota, and it's designed to give you some practical examples and advice on how to follow fair housing laws in your daily interactions as a housing provider. Fair housing is ultimately, it's about equal treatment and treating all renters the same, and that housing decisions about whether or not they're allowed to live somewhere, or their housing experience, their actual living experience, is not based on race, color, religion, creed, national origin, disability, marital status, sexual orientation. Those types of things are not allowed to be factors in the decision of whether someone can live somewhere, and are not allowed to be something that reduces their enjoyment of the living space. The laws governing fair housing are the Federal Fair Housing Act, the Minnesota Human Rights Act, as well as some local ordinances on the city level. And so we're going to cover those laws and rules that guide the housing process and protect renters in this process. So the question is, why fair housing? Why should we care about fair housing? Why is it something that we should learn about and follow? Well, first is money. And money is something that becomes a major part in fair housing when a renter has a complaint or feels like they're being discriminated against or being treated unfairly. And the way it becomes an issue is that a renter makes a complaint, and HUD or legal aid investigates that complaint. And these complaints turn into hiring an attorney, and hiring an attorney turns into legal bills. And this entire process at the end can sometimes turn into fines that can range and be very significant. Fines to the degree that in some cases landlords have lost their business or rental property because of the amount and the extent of the fines. Another reason is that it's the law. Fair housing was passed so that people would not be discriminated against based on things like race and color and religion and national origin and disability, but that their housing options wouldn't be limited by those things, but that they would have free choice to live in places of their choosing. And the idea here is that housing decisions are not based on protected classes, examples of the things that I mentioned, but are based on rental criteria that's been determined and set and communicated in advance. And that's what housing decisions are based on, not somebody's status. And finally, you want to care about fair housing because it's the right thing to do. So what is not allowed in the fair housing process? Well, things you can't do is you can't deny a unit that is available to someone. You can't offer different terms or conditions. You're not allowed to steer. You're not allowed to advertise indicating illegal preferences. You cannot deny reasonable accommodations that are ultimately determined to be reasonable. And you can't have an environment that is hostile with slurs or harassment or violence. Now, an example of a lawsuit that happened actually here locally in the Twin Cities is a landlord in Minneapolis was offering different lease terms based on race. So the landlord would only offer a month-to-month lease to members of a certain race, and then members of other races were not given that same option. At the end of the day, as a result of that treatment, offering different terms, a month-to-month lease to members of one race, and not offering that term to members of another race, that landlord ended up having over $200,000 in fines as a result of that violation of fair housing. And so you can see that it's very important to follow for both the money reasons and because it is the right thing to do. So the protected classes in Minnesota are the following: race, sex, religion, familial status. And to provide a little bit of explanation about what familial status is when there is the presence of minors that live in the household. So this is minors of their parents or their legal guardian, or who the parents have designated in writing the guardian of the minors. And so if there are minor children in the household, that's familial status and who is protected. There is disability. National origin, and national origin is the country where the individual comes from. Color. Creed. Now some people ask, what is the difference between creed and religion? Well, creed is a set of beliefs. And so, as a sort of light example, if somebody thinks that squirrels hold special powers and they hold this set of beliefs, that is their creed. And you can't discriminate based on someone's set of beliefs or their creed, whether or not you think it's valid or true. Sexual orientation. Ancestry, and that's just in Minneapolis and St. Paul. Marital status. And marital status means married, divorced, remarried, single. And so it's any type of really relationship status you're not allowed to discriminate against. The receipt of public assistance. The receipt of public assistance is things like welfare or food stamps. And an example of discrimination in this type would be if there was a policy that somebody was not allowed to use welfare money to pay for a security deposit. That is discrimination that you can engage in, and receipt of public assistance in that type of way is protected. And then finally, in St. Paul, age is also a protected class. So let's talk for a moment about obvious discrimination versus subtle discrimination. Another way to put this might be intentional discrimination versus unintentional discrimination. For example, obvious discrimination could be something like, well, a person of such and such race is not allowed to live here. Or an environment that is hostile, or where there are slurs. An example of subtle discrimination would be something like, there are not a lot of kids that live at this property, or, oh, you have a lovely accent. It's a very nice accent. And another example is to just be aware of sexual harassment. And when I talk about the obvious versus subtle discrimination, or intentional versus unintentional, it's the unintentional discrimination that you really have to watch out for and be aware of as a landlord, because the things that you say are huge. And you don't want to try to connect with someone based on their status of a protected class. And what I mean by that is if somebody is of a certain race, or has a background that we find fascinating, but it's a protected class, addressing those in conversation can be a very dangerous thing to do, because the person who's receiving that message can interpret those types of things in a variety of ways. And so given that you're watching this video and that you've decided to learn about fair housing, it's likely that obvious discrimination may not be something that will be an issue or get you in trouble. Obviously, it's something that you should not engage in, but it's the unintentional discrimination or the subtle discrimination and the things that we do that might seem natural to us are the things that oftentimes can get you into some fair housing trouble. And so the first tip really here is to avoid talking about things that address a protected class. Because remember, no decision on that person's ability to live in the home can be based on the protected classes that we just covered. And so while you're showing the unit, while you're talking to them on the telephone, the protected classes and those types of issues have to be avoided. So as a landlord, you want to think about is what do you hear and how does that impact the way that you treat that individual? What I mean by that is when you answer the phone call or you talk to somebody in person, you hear their tone of voice. You might hear an accent. And the way that a person talks, it's very natural for us to paint a picture of that person in our head. And the picture that we paint is very natural and it happens. But one thing we have to do is make sure that the picture that is in our mind does not impact the way that we treat that person or the way that we treat them or serve them or the type of housing opportunities that they are offered. So think very carefully, and when you go into the process of talking to somebody on the phone or in person, you want to really make sure that you're not allowing the picture that you've painted in your head to become an issue as far as how you treat that person or the housing options that you provide to them. This is also similar in terms of, as a landlord, what do you see? When somebody comes in to view your property, there's something you're going to notice. Obviously, you're going to notice the way the person's dressed. And what can you learn about somebody based on what you see? Well, you can see the color of their skin. You might think that based on seeing them, you can determine what race they're from or what their national origin, or country of origin is. Depending on what that renter is wearing, you might think you know what their religious beliefs are or how they live their life. But what you see sometimes is deceiving. The old saying that don't judge a book by its cover, that really has to apply in fair housing and when you're working with renters and showing them their housing options. Because what you see oftentimes is deceiving, and also what you see oftentimes falls within a protected class. And if what you see falls within a protected class, you want to make sure that it doesn't impact how you treat that renter or the housing options they're provided or their living experience. Because what happens here, and really what you're trying to avoid, is having a complaint based on fair housing. And if what you hear impacts the picture you create in your mind, what you see causes us naturally to create judgments. So we have to be aware of that so that we don't treat renters in ways that could cause a complaint related to fair housing, which can lead down a pretty painful road for somebody who is a housing provider. So to help with some of these issues is to provide some customer service tips. And these tips are designed to help you really set up in advance how you are going to treat renters. Because determining in advance and having a process set up for how you show housing and how you offer housing can help you avoid acting in ways or saying things that could generate a fair housing complaint or a violation. So service tip number 1, focus on the renter's wants and needs, not yours. It really is about the preferences of that renter. Oftentimes being a landlord and being a housing provider is really challenging at times. And there's a unique dynamic of when you get a number of renters sharing a building and wanting to keep that environment peaceful and enjoyable for all. And oftentimes landlords have pain from the past and times that things didn't go so well with renters. And that sometimes can cause landlords to want to create rules or act in ways that end up violating fair housing law and then generating the complaints. And so when a renter comes in, you don't want to think about what are the needs that I have as a landlord or a housing provider here. You first want to focus on their wants, their needs, and their preferences. And when you do that, you're offering them the options that are of their desire, not of your desire. And one of the things I'll get at in a little bit here is how steering impacts that often. Steering by meaning that sometimes people want to say, well, we like to have families with kids on the first floor because it's less disruptive to the other renters. And so rather than showing them units available or on the third floor or making them aware of that option, you end up steering them or guiding them to that first floor unit to meet your needs. But the thing here in serving the renter's wants and needs is letting them know what all of their options are that are available and then letting them choose which ones they want to see. Service tip number 2 is that protected classes are not selling points. What I mean by that is sometimes we might feel like we have a special connection to people of a certain race or of a certain country. Maybe we went on vacation to a country and found out that this person was from there. And sometimes we make protected classes selling points with good intentions in terms of, I really want to connect with this individual. Or I feel like I connect with this person because I'm within the same protected class as they are. But the thing is, that increases your risk. When you make protected classes a selling point or a way to connect with someone, we think that we're making them more comfortable. And in some cases, maybe we are making them more comfortable, but we're putting ourselves at risk that we might actually be making them feel uncomfortable. and that we're making an issue of their protected class, their status as a member of a certain protected class, and that that we're going to somehow show them housing units or treat them differently. Because remember, it's about treating everyone the same in fair housing. You don't want to treat anybody differently, and so trying to connect with someone based on a protected class and making a protected class a selling point can increase risk, and risk that a complaint of discrimination could come your way. Service tip number 3 is to let each renter know all of their options. What I mean by that is a renter comes to visit your property and they're looking for a 1-bedroom, and you might have a variety of 1-bedrooms available. One on the first floor, one on the second floor, third floor, in different buildings. This point really relates to point number 1 of making sure that the renter's wants and needs come first is letting them know each of their options so that they can choose what they want to see. Service tip number 4 is to return every phone call. And where this becomes important is when, let's say you had one available unit on your property, or maybe you only have one unit, and it's full. But you're busy and you don't take the ad down from the advertising source, and so a number of calls come in and people are inquiring about that available unit, and you no longer have it available. Well, you want to make sure that you return every phone call, because if you treat one person of one race differently and return that phone call, and then you don't return the phone call of somebody of another race or another protected class, that could generate a complaint. And then if it's shown that you're treating people unequally, that you're returning phone calls of one renter or one type of renter and not another, even if it's not your intent, the reality is that you've treated people differently if you haven't returned that phone call. And so to return every phone call is a wise choice. Another alternative to this is to put on your voicemail message that the unit is now full and that you will not be returning phone calls. So either return everybody's phone call who called your property, or put on the voicemail message that that unit is no longer available and you will not be returning calls. Because remember, you're trying to avoid doing anything that generates a fair housing complaint. Because again, sometimes discrimination is not intentional. It's subtle. And so you have to be aware of the types of things you're doing that are subtle discrimination, like not returning a phone call. It might be something that seems challenging or hard to digest, but that's the reality. Service tip number 5, and I've said it before and I'll say it again, but it's worth repeating, is to treat everyone the same. And by treating everyone the same, oftentimes that actually requires scripting your tour, or having a process that you follow, that when the renter calls, this is the process that we follow. And then when a renter comes in to visit, this is the process that we follow. And you have that process in place to make sure that nobody is getting preferential treatment or unequal treatment. And that leads into service tip number 6, which is to script your tour. Now, in scripting your tour, I think there are really 4 steps to doing that. And this is assuming that you've talked to the person on the phone, they've set the appointment, and they've come out to view the available units. And the first is to determine the renter's wants and needs. When you're scripting your tour, they come in. This relates all the way back to service tip number 1, is you want to find out, why is the renter looking to live in that area? How many bedrooms do they need? What rent range are they trying to fit within? What property amenities are most important to them? What is their floor preference? And again, how many bedrooms do they need? You're determining the experience that the renter wants and what they want to see, because then that helps guide what you show them, and you're treating them equally. Number 2, in the scripting your tour, is telling them about all available units. So they've come in looking for a 2-bedroom. You want to let them know all the 2 bedrooms that are available. And you want to let each renter that comes in know all the 2 bedrooms that are available, and then let them make the determination of which ones that they want to see based on the preferences and wants and needs that they have communicated to you. Because remember, you're not imposing your preferences on them. You're hearing what their preferences are and then showing them all of the available options. And you do this each and every time with each and every renter, no matter what. And I said let them choose the units that they want to see. And then finally, show your common areas, your amenities, and the unit in the same order. Now, a renter may indicate to you that they're not really concerned or don't care about a swimming pool. Or maybe they don't care about the party room or some other feature at your property. Even so, you still want to show the common areas, the amenities, and the unit in the same order to each renter every time. Now, you might slow down and emphasize features based on comments that someone makes or preferences that they indicate. But each and every time you want to have this tour scripted so that you're not generating any complaints or somebody doesn't feel like they're being treated differently from somebody else, or that somebody else got shown more things or different things or in a different order. Again, you're trying to avoid complaints, trying to avoid the unintentional or subtle discrimination that sometimes happens. And so scripting your tour and having that process that you follow each and every time will help you avoid that. So one question that oftentimes can get asked by renters is, who lives here? And that really is a loaded question. Who lives here? And the reality is that you have to be very careful about how you answer that question. Because sometimes what people are wondering is, are there people like me that live here? Or are there other people who live here that I don't necessarily want to live around? And you've got an open unit to fill. But the thing is, you do not want to generate any fair housing complaints. And so be careful about how you answer this question. So depending on your sense of humor, you might answer that question, human beings live here. And see if you can answer it that way and move on. Possibly a more practical answer is that anyone who meets our rental criteria is welcome to live here. Or a wide variety of people who meet our rental criteria live here. Another option is to say that we don't discuss the types of people that live here. There are fair housing laws that protect renters from discrimination, and so we do not discuss who lives here or the type of people that live here. And so if that question comes up, do not use it as a selling point. That goes back to not using protected classes as a selling point. Who lives at your property really can't be a selling point. And you have to answer that question in that way. And even when you're showing the property to someone, you don't want to indicate who lives at the property if you think it's a selling point for that individual, because it may or may not. And if it's not, then you're putting yourself at higher risk for a complaint. I really want to get back to talking about steering here for a second. Steering can be one of those obvious forms of discrimination. It can be a subtle form of discrimination, but either way, it is something that you have to avoid. Now, an example of steering, and families with kids are really easy examples of this, is wanting to have families with kids live on a certain floor. I've talked to people before who have indicated that that is their preference as a landlord. That is their preference, to have families with children on a certain floor. And if you guide a family with children to that unit on that floor and not let them know of their other options, that is steering, and it's illegal. It's a violation of fair housing. You want to avoid it. Another might be, maybe you really like this unit over by the playground, and that you're steering them to that unit. And so make sure, this goes back to showing that family or showing the renter all of their options, so that you're not steering them to one based on your preference, but that you're actually showing them the units, letting them know all of the available units and showing them based on their preferences. Same goes for maybe you know people of a certain race or national origin, or the married couples tend to live somewhere in the building. You don't want to indicate that. You don't want to share that. You don't want to steer people in that direction. All right, so now for a little bit, let's talk about reasonable accommodation. First, let me say is that when you get a reasonable accommodation request, it's a good idea to consult an attorney. A 15-minute call can save you a lot of trouble and difficulty and challenges. Reasonable accommodation issues are often complicated. And so you want to make sure that you're handling them correctly so that complaints aren't generated. A couple of things to note about reasonable accommodation. One is that the request does not have to be in writing. And the renter also does not have to use the words reasonable accommodation. And you want to have a set process to handle reasonable accommodation requests. Now, let me back up for a minute and talk about what is a reasonable accommodation request. Well, if somebody has a disability, that could be a mental disability, a sensory disability, a physical disability, a reasonable accommodation request is something that might make a physical alteration to the building or their unit so that they're able to enjoy their living space equal to somebody else. And it also might be an alteration in your policies. So maybe you're a no pets building or a no pet property, and you end up needing to make a reasonable accommodation for a pet based on the disability that the individual has. So it's making an alteration to the physical structure or to your policies to allow equal enjoyment, to allow that individual equal enjoyment of their unit. So with reasonable accommodation, one of the issues that you're likely to encounter is that of a companion or service animal. It's pretty basic. Companion animal is something that somebody has to help them with their disability as well as a service animal. A couple of things to note. With companion or service animals, you're not allowed to charge pet deposits, pet rent, or other types of fees that are connected to that. Even if you normally charge pet deposits, pet rents, or other fees related to pets for just people that have pets, you're not allowed to charge those fees for a companion or service animal. With these, you can ask for verification, oftentimes known as a doctor's note, and the need for the reasonable accommodation. And another important thing to note with companion animals and service animals is that you do not want to talk with other residents about a certain resident's circumstance or situation. Because if it's a no pets building particularly, and then other residents see that somebody has an animal, whether it's a companion animal or service animal, they might ask why they're not allowed to have one. And you're not allowed, and you do not want to talk about that particular renter's specific circumstances. You want to treat these on an individual basis so you can invite that renter who is asking that question to submit a request, and then you have your process that you've set up to handle reasonable accommodation requests. Structural changes to the building are another type of reasonable accommodation. This can really vary quite widely. It can be grab bars in the bathroom, making alterations to the kitchen, widening doorways. Sometimes it's a ramp to the building. So structural changes are examples of types of accommodations that people may request to help them enjoy the building or the unit. So one of the questions is, what's considered unreasonable? Well, if it creates an undue financial or administrative burden, or if it creates a fundamental alteration in the nature of the provider's operations. Who pays for a reasonable accommodation? Well, oftentimes it's the tenant. So the tenant says, I would like this accommodation to be made. You have your process set up to determine whether it's a reasonable accommodation. If it is reasonable accommodation, so let me back up here. If it doesn't create an undue financial or administrative burden, or there's not a fundamental alteration in the nature of your operations, the tenant can pay for that accommodation. The housing provider in certain circumstances will pay for the reasonable accommodation. Oftentimes this is related to if the property has some type of federal funding. In other cases, both. So sometimes the housing provider will split the cost with the tenant. And so you want to have your process set up to handle reasonable accommodation requests to determine if they are reasonable, and then if they are reasonable, you move forward with them. Because these issues are complicated, and even determining what's reasonable and unreasonable, it can be a very good idea to consult an attorney when reasonable accommodation requests come, just to make sure that you handle it appropriately and fairly. So let's talk here about rental criteria. Rental criteria is important because it is the one thing on which you can make a decision about whether somebody is allowed to live at your property. Up to this point, we've addressed protected classes. things like race and color and creed and religion, marital status, sexual orientation, disability. Those things you can't make rental decisions based on. But your rental criteria, you can, which is why you want to think through in advance what your rental criteria is and have a process set up by which you determine whether or not a renter meets your rental criteria. So first, one thing to note, there was a law passed in the state of Minnesota that if you charge an application fee, you have to provide your rental criteria in writing to that renter to let them know what you are basing your decision on. So when they fill out that application and they pay that fee, make sure that you provide that criteria in writing. Types of rental criteria that you can use to base your decision on are income. So you can require that the renter makes 1 times the rent, 2 times the rent, 3 times the rent. You set that rental criteria, you communicate it in advance so that they're aware of whether or not they meet it. And then if they don't meet your criteria for income, then they're not allowed to live at your property. Another type of rental criteria is criminal. So you can have standards related to criminal background, that if they have a certain type of criminal background, they're not allowed to live at your property. And this can vary widely from landlord to landlord and property to property. Some properties might say you're not allowed to have any felonies at all. Others might say no felonies within the last 5 years. Others might be concerned just about certain types of criminal activity that have happened. So you can set your criminal background criteria and deny housing based on that. Another is credit. This is pretty straightforward. You can determine whether or not you can set a credit score, a credit threshold that renters have to meet, and that if they don't meet it, they're not allowed to live at the property. And rental history. You can determine that a landlord needs a certain amount of positive rental history up to this point in order to live at your property. Rental criteria are the things on which you base your decisions about whether or not somebody can live at your property, not protected classes. So make sure that you have your rental criteria set thoughtfully and carefully, and that all of your decisions are based on that. And that when you're showing renters your available unit or available units, that the rental criteria are the issues on which you're making your decision, not anything that is related to a protected class. And that doesn't just include the yes, you're allowed to live here and no, you're not allowed to live here. It's about the process of showing them that unit. And that when you're showing them that unit, it's based on their options, their choice. Fair housing is about choice. And the choice is in the hands of the renter. But where you have a choice is in setting your rental criteria and making the renter meet the specific criteria to live at your property. And that's what your decision is based on as a landlord. So in closing, I wanted to let you know that we do have resources on our website related to fair housing. So you can go to www.housinglink.org. And on our website, under Housing Resources, you can find documents related to fair housing. We have a document that shows what the different protected classes are in Minnesota and some of the different procedures related to fair housing. Finally, I am not an attorney, and this presentation was not legal advice. Fair housing issues sometimes are complicated, and don't hesitate to contact an attorney if you feel that you need to, and make sure that you're aware of the fair housing laws and watch out for the subtle, non-intentional discrimination. The obvious discrimination is clear and is something that you should never do. You want to watch out for the unintentional, subtle discrimination on which so many complaints are based. Make sure to avoid that and provide equal opportunity and fair treatment to renters everywhere. Thank you.